You've heard me say about 1,000,000 times that white supremacy is a con. And like all cons, the key is to get the mark to con himself. This is where repetition comes into play. White supremacy is always repeating the same old lies over and over again. And the propaganda arm of white supremacy, the white media, makes sure that they control people's minds through limiting what they're allowed to hear. You're only allowed to hear the same old stale white supremacist talking points, and you're never allowed to hear any voice to the contrary. That's deliberate. It's a crucial piece of the puzzle. If somebody says something that they are not supposed to be saying, then you attack them, you discredit them, you try to debunk them, you tell everybody, well, this is a fringe opinion. Responsible people would never believe this. Oh, this is just outside the scope of rational conversation. This is a time-honored technique, but the technique that white supremacy also likes to use is imagery. After all, human beings take in most of their information solely through their eyes. We don't really do a whole lot of testing of things through any other means. And so white supremacy has always made sure to invest in visual media. Whether it's images of black people in blackface, whether it's the movies, television. But when it comes to white supremacy's leaders, when it comes to white supremacy's biggest thugs, they like to make sure that the images are literally carved in stone. Now, before I go any farther, I know that some of you might have been expecting that I was going to do some sort of 4th of July address, but the truth of the matter is, white supremacy just doesn't rise to that import where I need to make it a point to do so. After all, for those of us living the B1 life, the 4th of July is just another Wednesday. But that's not to say that we're not going to bang on the beast afterwards anyway. I was thinking about all the people who were basically trying to ask why it is that Professor Black Truth, offline that is, doesn't take part in the 4th of July. And it's one of those cases of, why would anyone celebrate the 4th of July? Why would anyone celebrate the birth of a predator nation, the birth of an evil empire? Well, it's because they've been taught to. Sure, you got the folks who, as far as they're concerned, it's a day off work, or it's a sanctioned day to have a barbecue. You know, you're being given permission by the white powers that be to have some time off. Kind of like the slaves with the pork barrel. One day a year, the slaves would be allowed to actually have something other than pig's guts. So they would fight over the pork barrel, but it was just a sanctioned day that white supremacy would allow them to have off. Same thing goes for the 4th of July. People getting happy and they don't even know why, they just are. And getting happy because of the ruthless, immoral, slave-owning, degenerate, genocidal thugs who founded this empire of evil, you gotta have no brain cell in your head if that doesn't disgust you. But then again, for a lot of people, they believe the hype, and the hype has been fed to them through the society itself. You ain't even got to look to movies and such. Any time that you try to study the trappings of the administrative arm of white supremacy, I mean the white government, what you see is that they take their biggest thugs and give them places of honor, indeed the central places of governmental authority, and they make sure that their images happen to be very, very sophisticated, very, very dignified. Because after all, they want to make it clear to you that these men are important. But what they really mean is obedience to white supremacy is important. As a case study, let's take a detailed look at the imagery, especially the early imagery surrounding old Pinewood Dentures himself, George Genocide Washington. And what you see is that during the early years, in fact, before this guy was even through with his presidency, white supremacy was already going about trying to mythologize him. And the way that they chose to go about doing it says a lot. Now, we're not going to tackle this in chronological order, and there's a reason for that which will become apparent. Let's go ahead and take a look at one of the later statues of Washington that was done while he was still alive. In 1818, while Washington was in retirement from the presidency and public life, George Washington was contacted by his fellow rednecks in the North Carolina legislature who told him that they wanted to create a statue of him. Well, when you take somebody with a body count and a number of slaves as great as George Washington, when you got somebody this evil and this corrupt, when you have evil incarnate like this, you really got to scratch your head and ask, who can properly capture something so malevolent, something so degenerate? How do you capture something so purely evil, the devil in stone? I mean, how do you do that? Well, talk about the right tool for the right job. It was a fellow satanic degenerate TJ, you know, Thomas Jefferson, who said, "There can be but one answer to this. Old Canove of Rome. No artist in Europe would place himself in a line with him." Now, this guy that they're talking about, who he nicknamed Old Canove, he was talking about Antonio Canova. And this guy was at the turn of the 19th century, he was basically one of, if not the most respected sculptor on the entire planet, because he had already made his name by doing such propagandistic works as busts and statues of Napoleon, and he also excelled in doing these idealized portraits of Greek icons. And that was important to the guys that be, because the Greeks, they helped to pioneer the idea of taking their mere mortal men and trying to cast them in the same way of a god. The Greeks were the ones who started that pathetic, putrid tradition. And so you had guys thousands of years later who were like, well, hell, if it was good enough for the Greeks, a bunch of fakers, frauds, and phonies of their day, it's good enough for us, because we're just as fake and fraudulent as they were. So it was Thomas Jefferson who was the one who suggested the sculptor for this so-called portrait of George Washington, and it was also Thomas Jefferson's idea that George Washington be shown in Roman military attire. Not just Roman attire, but Roman military attire. And they have him here writing. I mean, this kind of thing of showing a figure who's etching something on a stone, on a tablet, that's basically one of their favorite bits of agitprop. But this whole sculpture by Antonio Canova, it just lets you know that these guys had way too high an opinion of this clown. George Washington had absolutely nothing to do with Rome, to the best of my knowledge, because of the fact that the man wrote so little, because he was killing so much. I don't know if this man even knew anything about Latin. He probably knew one or two small words of pig Latin, but I doubt that the man could actually speak Latin in any shape, form, or fashion. So why on earth would you associate a man who was not Roman in any shape, form, or fashion with Rome? If you look at George Washington's genealogy, no doubt his family tree would be a straight line. What you find is that he's Anglo-Saxon. The guy's English. That's how he started his life. All those guys did. All the founders of the United States started off originally as English subjects. So that being the case, George Washington's descendants were enslaved by the Romans. But at the end of the day, white supremacy knows no honor. White supremacy knows no morality. You're dealing with a bestial mindset. You're dealing with a satanic ideology. They don't care about anyone, not even themselves. The U.S. itself is largely based on Rome. That's the reason why they decided they would constantly imitate Roman iconography. The Romans had a Senate, and so does the United States. The symbol of Rome, the Roman totem, was the eagle, and that's also the symbol of the United States. Rome was a hyper-violent martial state that drenched the Mediterranean in blood. Well, the U.S. did one better than that. They drenched the whole damn world in blood, particularly Africa. Now, while this sculpture commissioned by the North Carolina legislature happens to be idiosyncratic, it happens to be incongruent, it simply doesn't follow, as ridiculous on its face, there's a lot of things you can say about it, but one of the things that you also have to say is it's not a one-off either. Because you can see this sculpture of George Washington, which was commissioned by the United States Congress itself in 1832. Now, take a look at this thing. This looks exactly like something out of ancient Greece, and that's for a reason. The very pose that you see Washington having been sculpted in, it's modeled directly after a statue, a similar statue of Zeus. So they went beyond just saying that George Washington's Caesar. This guy is a god, the greatest of the king of the gods. And this is the United States Congress that did this. This wasn't a couple of rednecks in a state legislature. This wasn't a couple of high-minded slave owners out in the boonies. This was the United States federal government who commissioned a statue of George Washington that was meant to deify him. So who created the myth of George Washington the God? The United States government did. The white men who commissioned these works, they wanted to establish that the founders of the U.S. were divine, beyond criticism, and the quintessential example of this divinity was going to be George Washington himself. These guys were enshrining themselves as gods. Now, this sculpture in particular was done by a guy named Hiram Powers in 1844. And I want you to understand that. This sculpture was done long after George Washington was already in his crypt and burning in hell, after practically all of the original founders of the United States were already dead. And yet this imagery, this iconography, this theme of George Washington as a god endured. They continued to push this lie. This wasn't being done by men who knew Washington. It was being done by men who understood that they could benefit by furthering and promoting the lie of George Washington, the American Caesar. You would think that the people, the common folk even, would be laughing and going, why are you having George Washington? The dude's running around in a petticoat with wooden teeth, and you got him dressed up as Caesar. Are you nuts? But people have not only accepted this lie, they have bought into it, and as far as they're concerned, this is part of the national character, or rather, national lack of character. However, I think the most telling of these obscene dedications to George Washington the Monster was among the first. Washington's own Virginia state legislature commissioned a statue of him, which was completed in 1796. And this was while George Washington, I believe, was still president. Or at least not long after he left office. The point is, it was very close to his administration. It, too, had Washington with a Roman theme. And he's shown standing beside what appears to be a Roman column, except if you know anything about Rome, you know that what Washington's standing beside, that's not just some column. What you see is a Roman fasces. And the fasces was a symbol of ancient Rome. It symbolized power and authority, specifically authority over life and death. But the reason that the fasces caught my attention is because fasces is where we get the term fascism from. And even though the term fascism itself didn't exist in the late 18th century, I'm not so naive as to delude myself into thinking that the inbreds of Virginia didn't have the concept. They damn sure were exercising it every single day. The degenerates who founded the United States practiced fascism far better than Benito Mussolini ever did. Fascism is dead in Italy, but it's alive, well, and on the rise in the United States, because, truth be told, the United States is the home of fascism. It's the home base of fascism. It's fascism headquarters. And don't think that the Congress was going to be left out. Keep in mind that the image of the Roman fasces is not merely something for legislators in the states. You can find it literally at the very heart of the United States Congress. If you've ever paid attention to a presidential State of the Union address, you'll notice that beside the Vice President and the Speaker of the House, ringed on either side, are the Roman fasces. And this is the United States government that has the symbol of ancient Rome's brutality and authority through violence, all for the world to see at the very core of the American government. And by the way, this image of George Washington standing in front of a fasces, it wasn't just some one-off, because you see this exact same statue, or rather the motif of this statue engraved in similar sculptures in front of the South Carolina Capitol building, in front of George Washington University Law School, even in front of the state capitol of New York. And this exporting of the myth of George Washington didn't stop at America's shores. This image of George Washington in front of his favorite image, the fasces, stands in Trafalgar Square in England. And I'm sure without too much effort you could probably find plenty of other examples. But I hope that the point is made. George Washington shone in front of a symbol of Roman violence and oppression. When you see the exact same image copied down to the smallest scintilla, and you see it copied over and over and over again all over the country in front of their very centers of political power, the places where the white men get together and write up the laws to screw black people over. They didn't do that just because you got some white guys with a kinky fixation on imagining themselves as being like the Caesars. This isn't some Roman fetish. This is an expression of ideology that you're seeing. If people actually talked about what the Roman fasces was, they'd be like, what the hell would you want to associate that with the United States for? So what happens is they don't tell them, they just go ahead and do it. Because you see, while the man on the street may not know what the fasces is, and while a lot of you looked at that image and didn't recognize what the fasces was until I told you, you better believe that the white men who commissioned these statues, and not a few who worship these images today, they know exactly what the fasces is. They didn't put that there accidentally. They did it deliberately. And by putting these images all over the nation, they're sending a message of who's in charge, what the people in charge believe, and what they intend to do in order to keep things in the twisted, sick, demented state that they're in today. These statues are hundreds of years old. This ain't even like those stupid Confederate statues that only got put up around the turn of the 20th century. These things got put up practically while George Washington was still president. They started the deification of this guy as soon as he brought his wooden choppers into the White House. Well, I shouldn't say into the White House, because the White House didn't exist. But as soon as this guy was taking power unto himself, no sooner than he was setting himself up as El Jefe, setting himself up as Il Duce, setting himself up as the American Hitler, they decided, well, we got to make sure that people understand that Hitler has a divine right to rule. And just in case you missed the point, in case you didn't understand, we're going to have all sorts of iconography that you know to associate with Greek gods. We're going to just portray George Washington as a Greek god. There was one idiot in particular who did a nude statue of George Washington. And as you know, George Washington was a pudgy little bastard. The boy had a paunch. He had that double chin thing going. I guess when you're not used to having to pick your own cotton, when you're not used to having to work at all, you know, you do tend to pack on a couple extra pounds. Oh, but not this statue of George Washington nude. All of a sudden they decided that George Washington needed to have a washboard stomach and a barrel chest. Because, you know, we want to show that George Washington was physically powerful. Please. Please. This was a man who didn't believe in doing any work. But this was part of the myth that they wanted to create about the guy. And it is a lie that is hundreds of years old. A lie that has been perpetuated and promoted at the highest levels of the government by the United States Congress, no less. And they started with the lie, the mythologizing of George Washington as soon as the man took power. They wasted no time manufacturing a legend about him. They wasted no time creating the myth of George Washington. And they chose Washington for a reason. See, there were a lot of white trash who took part in the American Revolution, but George Washington holds a specific, peculiar place among them because he was practically the only one who had been a military man. If they had tried to deify or canonize or lionize a mere politician like John Adams, that simply wouldn't have done. And if they had tried this stunt with a self-important cosmopolite like Ben Franklin, that wouldn't have sufficed either. And let's be honest, a self-serving, slave-owning, egomaniac rapist like Thomas Jefferson damn sure wouldn't have done. He wasn't even held in highest esteem by his own freaking peers. John Adams couldn't stand Thomas Jefferson. They needed somebody who at least they could all hold their noses for and say, okay, he ain't as odious as the rest of you clowns. They needed somebody who at least they could all agree on, and Washington was the guy who they had to go with. The same way that they demanded that the national bird be a bird of prey, it's the same way that they demanded that the individual to be deified would also be a predator. They didn't exalt George Washington for his intelligence. The boy wasn't that bright. They didn't exalt him for his diplomacy. They didn't exalt him for his business acumen. Like Thomas Jefferson, he married up. They exalted George Washington for one thing and one thing only: his willingness to kill for white supremacy. That was the sole quality that so endeared him to the men who decided that they were going to create the lie of George Washington the Divine. You see, they felt that he properly embodied the martial principle that had been the foundation of white supremacy and the foundation in life's blood of America's power. That's what got them so much of the world, and they intended to engrave that principle into the national psyche, that this, and this alone, was what made for the embodiment of the American ideal. Take a look at Mount Rushmore. If you take a look at Mount Rushmore, what you're going to see is that, sure, you had some white guys up there who were who were basically a bunch of egomaniacs and the rapists and such, but look at who was up there. George Washington was up there. Abraham Lincoln was up there. Teddy Roosevelt was up there. Now, yeah, Thomas Jefferson was up there too. But my question to you, though, is, do you know why it is that they chose those chumps in particular? What do 3 of the 4 clowns up there have in common? 3 of them took part in massive military conflagrations. 3 of those individuals took a big part in slaughtering God knows how many people for the sake of American power. That's what lets you know what's important to them. Reinforcing that martial principle over and over and over and over again. And of all the individuals on Mount Rushmore, they make sure that George Washington is the most prominent. Just in case you didn't understand. Yeah, they knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted to make it clear. Thomas Jefferson understood exactly the point that was being made when he said, make sure to have George Washington shown dressed up like a Roman general. See, he was setting Washington up to be the American idol. Not merely the American ideal, but the American idol. That's what was important here. You need to bow at the altar of George Washington. Because when you bow at the altar of George Washington, you're bowing at the altar of white supremacy. Those of us, the new voices of black media, you've heard us say over and over and over and over again that white supremacy is a religion, not merely because of the zeal of those who practice this satanic mentality, but it's a religion primarily because that's how they go about it. It's their MO. You take a look at these images of George Washington, this is not meant to merely make you think that this is a great man of politics. You're supposed to worship this man as a god. America is not a democracy, it's a theocracy. And the religion is white supremacy. And George Washington is not merely one of the high priests of white supremacy, he is the embodiment of its God. That's what's going on here. The Church of White Supremacy is nationwide, it's worldwide. It's a bigger religion than Christianity. It's a bigger religion than Islam, bigger than all of them put together. That's what you see here. The Church of White Supremacy demanding that you pay homage to the one true God, the white man. When you bow to George Washington, when you pay him any respect, you also have to bow and pay respect to all the people, innocent lives that he took. You have to bow and pay respect to all of the Africans that he had enslaved and abused and who died in his clutches. You got to sit there and bow down to all of that. Now, the same way that you didn't understand what the fasces was, but you think it's cool as a cute little Roman column, you're also bowing down to and you're paying respect to all the crimes that George Washington committed whenever you call yourself showing any sort of respect for him. This is the reason why I told you no black person should ever stand for the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, if you decide that maybe there's some other American patriotic song you want to stand for, well, there's no accounting for taste. But you're damn sure as a black person, you had a freaking slave owner's carol is what that song is. Written by a slave owner. Ain't no black person in his right mind should ever be standing for that song under any circumstances for any reason. And you never should be showing respect for George Washington. But there's been hundreds of years of teaching the public you're supposed to respect George Washington. This man is a god. But he's a god that you don't know anything about. The only thing you know about Washington is that he was a military man, full stop. You can't name so much as one quote from George Washington. You can't name anything from the guy, can you? Can you name any legislation that was passed when he was president? Can you name any legislation that he got through the Congress? In historical terms, George Washington was a man of few words, and when you look at his presidency, he was a man of even fewer ideas. As I said, thinking clearly wasn't this boy's strong suit. And yet his image is universally held in godlike esteem, and this from men starting hundreds of years ago, and continuing all the way to the present. You see, these guys weren't fools, though. They didn't truly believe that Washington was some godlike figure. And he probably looked at this and said to himself, man, you're pouring it on kind of thick, ain't you, fellas? But what all of these white men understood was the power of symbols. But more than that, they understood the power of myth. And with George Washington, they were manufacturing a hell of a myth, a hell of a fiction, a hell of a fraud. Greece had Alexander the Great. Rome had Julius Caesar, and so the United States would have George Washington. That's what this was meant to do. It was meant to say the same way that you saw these old Greek white guys who basically were only good enough to conquer a couple of fellow mud hut dwelling primitives in the Mediterranean basin. The same way that they were only able to get into brawls with other clowns in southern Europe. Well, George Washington, we want to make sure that he's connected to them. Okay, about the only connection that he has is that he likes to run around dressed up like them, playing Halloween in the middle of January. But, you know, you got to give him credit for trying. People didn't think of this degenerate Washington in terms of being a deity. The men who were trying to deify him, they didn't look at him as a deity. The public damn sure didn't think that George Washington was a god, and so they had to be taught, or rather miseducated, to see him that way. That's why these images had to be manufactured. Ridiculous though they may be, you take an immoral scumbag and you portray him as being divine, and you pour a ton of concrete into the foundation of this lie. You keep repeating the lie long enough, keep showing this fraudulent image of George Washington as a Caesar, George Washington as the modern-day Caesar, the modern-day Roman, the last Roman, the last Caesar. Keep pushing that lie. George Washington, the last Caesar. You keep pushing that lie long enough, sooner or later people are going to start to buy into it, especially when you have the government putting the unparalleled resources of the federal treasury behind this lie. You got taxpayers having their own money used to indoctrinate them. And this plays into the hands of the very men who create and perpetuate these lies, because you get to have fellow rednecks all the way up until the present in the modern-day American government. And it's no accident, it's no coincidence that I named for you state legislatures like North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, New York. You got these white supremacist con men in the legislatures today. They will gladly stand in front of George Washington's image, and the reason why is if you're bowing to George Washington's image, you're also bowing to the lie that these men are perpetuating today. They get to tell you, oh, well, I care so much about George Washington, I walk in the footsteps of George Washington. Yeah, they walk in the footsteps of George Washington's myth, of George Washington's lie. The people of Virginia certainly didn't vote for these images to be created. Neither did the South Carolinians or the New Yorkers, but they didn't have to. Their politicians did. The politicians understood the importance of creating this myth. When you create a legend, you're creating a narrative that gets handed down from one generation to the next. That's how legends work. They're passed on. But the other aspect to a legend is they get bigger and more grand over time. They become greater and greater every time that they're told. The story gets better. And so it is with George Washington. Of course, the myth was going to get out of hand. It was supposed to get out of hand. Because if people have the idea that they're not supposed to be challenging or questioning any of this garbage, then what that also means is they're never going to defy or question or challenge the putrid system of white supremacy that undergirds all of these lying images. Ain't that what I taught you about the propaganda arm of white supremacy? That the white media promotes white supremacy through lying images and fraudulent narratives. That's where these statues and the legend, the mythology, the myth, the fiction of George Washington the Divine comes in. Oh, I didn't chop down the cherry tree. Yeah, all of this stuff. Trash like Thomas Jefferson, who was also a slave-owning thief who presided over the slaughter of Africans for his own wealth. He was the guy who said, put George Washington in the attire of a Roman military officer. These types of measures, they're done to sanctify satanic acts. That's what it's about. Taking evil and trying to sprinkle some respectability on it. Now that these white supremacists had stolen everything, they had to convince people that God wanted them to have everything that they stole and slaughtered innocent people and stole it from them. And how better to convince people that you have a divine right to rule than to portray yourself as a god? George Washington knew exactly what he was doing. The concept of manifest destiny was already laid in place with his administration. They had no intention whatsoever of stopping at the Ohio Valley. As far as they were concerned, we're taking this show all the way to the West Coast. Yeah, we know we got the French and the Spanish standing between us and more of this real estate, but you know what? France is on its last legs. They've depleted themselves with their pointless 100-year war with Britain. And as for Spain, well, the closer we get to them, those clowns, they'll just give up the ghost, turn tail, and run as soon as they see us coming. Hell, the Spanish were never in the game to begin with. The expansion of the empire of evil westward, that wasn't some coincidence. It was the plan all along. How they were going to crack France, well, they knew that that was going to be just a matter of time. It wasn't going to be a matter of if, just a matter of be patient. And indeed, that's exactly how it turned out. In short order, next thing you know, they had the Louisiana Purchase. And how better to convince people that, well, it's the will of God that we should have this than to show images of the chief thug of American history, show him dressed up like a Roman general, show him in the same pose as Zeus, show him featured like a god. And people don't understand, these are idols that have been created for the people to bow down to. Now, the white population, they like bowing down to these guys as far as they're concerned. Yeah, this is how we got the system of economic and social giveaways and goodies and freebies that we have. Of course they're going to bow down to these men, but I don't want black people thinking that you're supposed to be bowing down. Okay? George Washington, the would-be god, you don't want to bow down to this clown because this is a god who has feet of clay. Okay? White men, both Yankee and Southern rednecks, they had such a strong affinity for the image of George Washington depicted beside one of Rome's foremost symbols of violence, brutality, and genocide and control. This tells you something. Because the people who did this weren't just at the federal government. It was state legislatures all over the country in the North and in the South. They couldn't agree on much. And keep in mind, these images were created well before the Civil War. So before these guys came to loggerheads with each other, before they came to blows with each other, They were already in agreement that if nothing else, they could at least all agree that violence and control through violence, which is what the fascist represents. It represents control through violence, authority through violence. Well, that's the one thing that all of these white men, no matter how much they differed with each other on everything else, they could at least agree on that. They could all agree that violence for the sake of power justifies itself. You couldn't have the myth of George Washington without making sure that you point out to people that, hey, power corrupts, and power through violence is the coolest thing of all. They've enshrined the concept that might makes right in this place. In this land, might makes right, and the more violence, the better. In this place, in this empire of evil, justice means nothing. Control is everything. And how do you get control? You get it through violence. I have the authority to rule. How did you get it? I got it through my willingness to kill without hesitation. When you hear clowns like Richard Spencer saying that he doesn't care about justice or morality, he's merely echoing the sentiments of the founders of the United States and their successors. All of these politicians in these state legislatures and the United States Congress, Richard Spencer is merely repeating them. That's the reason why he says that he doesn't care about the Declaration of Independence. He doesn't care about the United States Constitution. He understands that the real basis of American law is control through violence. These statues, they have significance because they were erected at the beginning of the U.S.'s existence. This tells you not merely what level of esteem George Washington was held in, but it also tells you what the men who venerated him were thinking, what their value system was, and what their successors' value system continues to be. You don't make statues like these and then put them up all over the country just because you like Washington. You do it because these works tell the public that this is a great man, that they ought to respect him, because he slaughtered entire nations for the sake of making sure the white folks could have a free ride. Because this guy made the world safe for tyranny. But most of all, they established that in this land a white man doesn't have to work for his daily bread. It'll just be handed to him. And just in case anybody disagrees, well, just keep in mind that the men who hold power, they are not going to hesitate for an instant to use violence to maintain it. Never before had this level of immorality been profitable, but now it was. The same venality, the same perversion, the same satanic zeal that made it where George Washington and Thomas Jefferson could marry their way up, it was the same basis upon which these white men today venerate them. The corporate titans of industry, you better believe these guys are patriotic as hell because the principle that's at stake for them is their white guarantees. They look at George Washington, as far as they're concerned, he didn't go far enough. He was just a good starting point. But they understand exactly what kind of power imagery has. So for the people who called themselves yesterday celebrating the 4th of July and their hearts went pitter-pat for America, and as far as they're concerned they can overlook George Washington's crimes, yeah, that just goes to show that the brainwashing has taken. Well, it better not take for you. Because George Washington, the would-be Caesar, and the clowns who decided that they were going to try to make him into a poor man's deity, before you go calling yourself, even for a moment, deciding that you're going to make an excuse for showing any respect for this animalistic bastard, you better remember something about these idols that they're telling you to bow in front of. The only thing that you get from bowing and scraping in front of an idol is your hands and your knees and your face dirty. That's all you get.